Hello and welcome to this very special Leadership Spotlight Series that's brought to you by the World Green Building Council as part of our World Green Building Week 2020. My name is Dominika Czerwinska and I'm the Director of Membership and Regional Networks at the World Green Building Council, and I will be your moderator for today. So in support of this year's campaign, #ActOnClimate, we are delighted to bring you a series of conversations involving industry leaders that are already #ActingOnClimate to discuss the opportunities that net zero buildings present in addressing some of the most critical issues of our time. This year, we are calling on governments to implement policy to drastically reduce emissions from the building and construction sector. Throughout this week, our network has been highlighting the action being taken by businesses, by governments, and by our green building councils to drive uptake of net zero buildings and the benefits that they bring for resilience in communities, the health of our planet and our society, and to support thriving economies. Our industry is ready to deliver to these standards across the mainstream, and bolder and more ambitious regulation is now required to unlock its full potential. Over the course of this past week, I hope that you have joined this special Spotlight series, which has been hosted by staff members from the World Green Building Council in conversation with very exciting leading industry experts. On Monday, we heard a compelling conversation moderated by our CEO, Christina Gamboa, about how we can build back better. On Tuesday, we had Katrina Brady, our head of Better Places for People, who led a discussion around how we enhance human health with net zero buildings. On Wednesday, we heard from Victoria Burrows, our Director of Advancing Net Zero, and her panel about net zero for communities, the planet, and economies. And yesterday, we heard from Matt Adams, our project manager for Advancing Net Zero, and he had the pleasure to bring embodied carbon up front with his panel, including a launch of our latest Asia Pacific embodied carbon primer report. So you can definitely find that on Twitter. If you missed any of these, however, don't worry, they are recorded and they'll be made available on our YouTube channel, so you can look for them there. And this brings us to our last, but certainly not least session of the week, where we are going to be looking at net zero buildings from the perspective of restoring and regenerating the health of the planet. Today, though, you can get involved by submitting any questions throughout the panel discussion that we have. Please submit them in the question box in the control panel. We will be keeping an eye on them throughout the session and try to bring them where we can. You can share your involvement in our event by posting on social media using the hashtags that you see below on the screen. You can visit our World Green Building Week website to find out how you can learn, share, and lead on net zero buildings. And there you will also find our call to action statement calling for governments to implement policy for net zero building and submit an endorsement. So with that, let's dive right into today's session. For today's panel, I am delighted to welcome Amanda Sturgeon. Amanda is a regenerative and biophilic design strategist and award-winning architect with global experience as a thought leader in bringing regenerative, zero carbon, and biophilic buildings, infrastructure, and cities to life. She is an author and TED speaker on biophilic design. Until recently, Amanda was the CEO of the International Living Futures Institute, which some of you might know was the home of the Living Building Challenge. Today, she is the regenerative design lead at Mott MacDonald, leading regenerative design projects and strategies across buildings, infrastructure, and cities in Australia, New Zealand, and Asia Pacific regions. Welcome, Amanda. If I could just ask you to turn on your camera at this point.
Thank you, Dominika.
Excellent. Next up, we have Dr. Paul Toyne. Paul has a diverse background, having worked all over the world as an environmental campaigner, conservationist, and sustainable built environment specialist. Within the field of property and construction, he has held group sustainability and environment director roles at Lendlease, WSB, and Balfour Beatty. Paul is a London Sustainable Development Commissioner appointed by the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, in 2010, and is a member of the UK government's Green Construction Board's Infrastructure Working Group. At Grimshaw, the global architecture and urban design practice, Paul leads their approach to net zero carbon and regenerative design. Welcome, Paul, and if I could have you turn on your camera as well. Excellent. Next up, we have Bill Browning. Bill is one of the green building and real estate industry's foremost thinkers and strategists, and an advocate for sustainable design solutions at all levels of business, government, and civil society. His expertise has been sought out by organizations as diverse as Fortune 500 companies, leading universities, nonprofit organizations, the US military, and foreign governments. Bill has played a critical role in the startup of several organizations close to our movement, such as Green Development Services at Rocky Mountain Institute, and of course, our very own US Green Building Council. Bill also writes and lectures widely on sustainable design and building practices. Welcome, Bill. And last but certainly not least, we have Andreas Geer. Andreas has been with Google's Real Estate and Workplace Services Sustainability team for over 9 years, and he has played a key role for Google Development and Interiors project in North America and Europe. He collaborates with projects and facilities teams to implement proven strategies and investigate emerging technologies and processes that positively impact the project's water and carbon footprint, as well as promote user experience and health within the built environment. He is proud to have worked on 6 Pancras Square in London, the first zero carbon certified project and the first ILFI certified project in Europe. Welcome, Andreas. Now I'm just going to get rid of the slide so that we can see everybody. Okay, excellent. So now we should all be able to see each other. Great. So a big thank you to our panelists for joining us today and for participating in this really important conversation. I'm really excited to be having this conversation today with you and such prominent expert panel because there's obviously a race that we are in to reach our very, very specific carbon targets in order to be able to mitigate the disastrous consequences of climate change. We also know that when we fail to look at the bigger picture, however, there are often unintended consequences that emerge. And so with today's conversation, I'd really like for us to be able to spend some time diving into regenerative, restorative, nature-based, biophilic design and what opportunities those hold in our race to achieve a net zero built environment. But before we dive right into unpack that, I wanted to, first, I think it's important to get a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about regenerative and restorative design, about biophilia, about nature-based solutions. So to our prominent panel today, do each of these terms hold their own definition, or do you find they're often used interchangeably? And what approach do you take to defining these terms in your practice? So we'll maybe start with Amanda.
Yeah, well, I mean, they all do have their own definition. I think, first of all, the important thing about all those terms is that they're all leading us in what I would think of the right direction, which is ultimately towards projects and design that can really give back and regenerate and restore ecosystems and communities. You know, I focused a lot on biophilia and biophilic design in the last decade in particular, only because I do see it as sort of a step in that direction. And nature-based solutions has also become a frequently used term for designing with nature. I think what they all have in common is that it's about letting nature lead. You're thinking about that connection to nature, that people are part of nature, and thinking about how ecosystems, health, and the influence of nature and what we can learn from nature and how it works as a system can actually influence what we do as we design. So the current way we work is economy, money first, and then people, and then nature's pretty much always at the bottom. So I think all of those terms flip that and say, actually, you know, we can't survive without nature thriving, and also nature pretty much has a lot of the solutions for figuring out how we do systems thinking and you know, think about more than just one aspect at a time. So I think, you know, they can't be, I mean, they are used sort of a little bit interchangeably, but I think they are distinct, but they're all sort of, from my perspective, leading us in a direction that's pretty common.
Thank you, Amanda. Paul, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm supportive of that. I have to say at this stage, it's probably useful for the viewers to understand that I'm an ecologist by training. And when you look into ecology, it's a study of the relationship of organisms with their physical environment. And one of the reasons why I moved from ecology and conservation into the built environment was because I could see with urbanization and the massive growth of population, if we can redesign our cities and the infrastructure and the buildings, we've got some chance of actually understanding how we can control the consumption patterns that have been driving the challenges that we now face, particularly around the climate change emergency, biodiversity loss, and a whole variety of other indicators that we see around the health of our planet, which are probably best summarized by the planetary boundaries work by the Stockholm Resilient Institute. So then when you come across and you look at holistically, as Amanda was saying, I think there are a number of steps that built environment professionals and in particular design engineering and architecture can look at. And the first one really is around adapting and making certain that we reuse and we don't waste anything. So if you go back to nature, there's nothing that's wasted in nature. One organism's waste is actually a nutrient and resource for another species. So we should really take that principle of adapting and reusing first. But then we do have very specific challenges, and actually that net zero carbon challenge, whether it's actually around carbon or water or energy, is a really important one that we have to address because of the emergency. So that net zero carbon, and I think it's really clear to state at this point, if we get to net zero carbon in our built environment, we will not have restored the health systems and ecosystem services that we depend upon. We will have helped stop the positive feedback system that will make it even harder and worse for us as we go into catastrophic climate change and the impacts of that. And that takes us into the need to restore. So we get to net zero carbon, and I kind of think about it as putting the brakes, let's say, on an electric bike. So we just halt and we stop that consumption, but we don't actually make things better. So we then need to go into that phase of restoration. And that's where I'm quite hopeful, because there's plenty of examples of how we can restore our natural environment to provide the services that we require, both for biodiversity, nature, and for ourselves. In particular, if you look at the cleaning up of the river systems that we've had across Europe. But restoration then needs to take us into a system where we're living in harmony with nature. So our cities, our infrastructure, our built environment aren't taking, but actually responding to when there are changes. And that takes you into the regenerative phase. And that's why it's really important to actually, the end game should be a system that we design through our built environment that is able to self-regulate. And that builds in that concept of resilience, so that our built environment needs to be resilient to those future shocks so it can regenerate naturally and doesn't always need a human intervention. So, you know, from Grimshaw's point of view, the kind of philosophy and the strategy that we're leading on is, you know, adaptation, reuse, moving into the net zero phase, recognizing that's not sufficient, that needs to happen within the next 5 years. Then we need to go into restorative and then fully regenerative design. And we've actually made that commitment to do truly socially and environmentally regenerative design by 2030, which I think will be a real challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great pathway that you've just painted there, from adaptation, reuse, net zero, and then specifically restoration, regeneration that leads us to resilience. So thank you for that. Bill, did you want to add on that point? I think you're on mute, Bill. Oh, we're still not hearing you. I've sent you an unmute request. There we go. Perfect. The nature of our world today.
So biophilia for us has long been an exploration of how we improve human health and well-being. And increasingly, we're interested in how these experiences of nature and the built environment lead us to think about the ecology and the places around us. So taking that next step. And we've been involved in large-scale net zero for quite a while now, and realized that that wasn't enough. And as our friend, the biologist Janine Benya says, nature doesn't do zero. Nature restores, nature generates, nature provides clean water. And so we've been involved now in an effort with a couple different companies, Google being one of them, and Interface Carpet being another, to experiment with doing metrics based on the ecosystem services of a site. So was the site sequestering carbon pre-development? How much was it sequestering on an annual basis? And we use that and trying to restore water coefficients and nutrient cycling and the services that the ecology of the site was providing as a way to frame long-term aspirational goals for where we want to be with the built environment.
Thank you, Bill. And Andreas, I know you wanted to jump in from a practical use perspective on, on the projects that you work on when it comes to some of these definitions.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, in part because I get to listen to my fellow panelists give their responses, because those are all, I think, amazing perspective to have. But also because it shows there is confusion around language like this at times. And I think that's something that we work to sort of clarify for our design and construction teams. And I've seen that it's not just about providing the what or even the why with these terms, but that it's also hugely impactful to show project teams a little bit about the how. And so we might have a small remodel project that doesn't necessarily have the ability to go fully into a regenerative design, but they can affect the human experience of nature within the workplace and address biophilia. And so we don't just want to say what biophilia is or why we care about it, but we want to talk about how it can be achieved, what's the best practice, what are things that we're interested in and that we've seen in the industry that we think could be a good solution. And it's important that we include some of this in the requests for proposals that go out to the design team, so that it's in their heads before they're even signed on to the project team. If someone doesn't get the job, they're still thinking about it for future jobs with other clients or with Google. And then we put it into our contracts and make sure that there's measurable metrics so that there's accountability. And the project team understands if they're on or off track. And I think that works for a small remodel project. I think that's also how we look at large scale regenerative design as well. Being really clear about what our targets are around carbon, water, and waste, defining ecology and resilience and health targets that if we just said, give us a building that has biophilia in it, we could get a really wide range of results. And it might sound like we're being kind of intense about how we're directing our project teams, but I think it's actually what they want. It's what they're asking for. They're saying, don't just give us the high level aspiration. We have so many things pulling us in different directions, from cost and schedule, aesthetics, safety, accessibility. Can you be as clear as those requirements are being to show us how to be successful, show us how we'll be measured, because ultimately they want to deliver a high quality product.
Thank you. And I think I might bring in this question that we just received, because I think it ties in well to what you're saying. There's a question around what tools do we have that allow us to easily evaluate the short and long-term economic contribution of nature to our building projects. And I think you referenced in general using requests for proposal as one tool to at least help direct that thinking, but are there other tools that you found are useful for helping to make those calculations for teams?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, it's probably looking for more public tools than we tend to be using some of our internal resources around just, how we're calculating embodied carbon impacts of new construction projects. But that said, there's life cycle assessment methodologies that are available publicly. And, you know, I think actually one of the interesting pieces of work that came out of the ecology program that we have in the Bay Area is that we've actually been able to publicly release some of the information that we're working with in some of the San Francisco Bay Area communities around tree planting schemes and some of the positive ecological benefits that we're looking to have with some of our landscaping projects.
Excellent, thank you. Before we move to our next question, does anybody else want to come in on that one? Useful tools that you found for evaluating the short and long-term economic contribution of nature to building projects?
So there are a couple. One's an educational tool that's specific to New York City, but it's one in which all of the analysis engine is viewable. It's a tool called Mannahatta 2409, and it was developed by the Wildlife Conservation Society, and it allows you to redesign on a 10-meter square basis New York City. And as you make your design changes, you can see the ecological implications of that in population and water and energy and a whole variety of different issues. But one of the powers of it is, one of the things that makes it powerful is that the actual, you're able to dig through some layers and actually see the analysis engine and all the calculation process for each of those. And so while it's specific to New York City, you can see the structure of how that's been thought through. There's another tool that came out in the last year or so that's right now mainly specific to North American markets, but it was supported by a number of tech companies and design firms and others called EC3. And it's an online tool that allows people to look at the carbon footprint of their specification choices in designing a building. And what's been intriguing about it, Microsoft's experience on their campus was that they were able to cut their carbon footprint of their materials choices by almost a third with no change in first cost, just by comparing different manufacturers' carbon footprints for the same product.
Thank you. That's so important to be able to have that access to the information so that you can start really early. Paul, did you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I think there is a real lack of understanding between a direct relationship of the design and construction process and the operation of the building or the city, and the flow upstream back into where those resources have come from and what the implications are. So we have LCAs, we have environmental product declarations for construction materials, etc. But if we are looking at regeneration and we are looking at biodiversity loss and restoring ecosystem services or impacts around pollution and nutrient flow, I don't think they are adequate. And we can create some unintended consequences, which I think is where the challenge is, that we can create a labeling system that allows a building owner and an asset owner to say, I've got a building that I believe is sustainable because it fulfills this certain criteria. But actually, if you map the whole footprint, both the social as well as the environmental footprint, and actually understand where the excavation of those materials came from and the impacts that they were having and whether they were sustainable or not, I think we'd get a different answer. And I don't think we have a sophisticated approach in being able to do that. And it requires a lot of investigation, and that's where we all kind of fall down. So I think it's a great question, and I'm not very confident that we have the tools, that we're actually measuring the things that really matter for us moving forwards.
Really useful. And I think that that is a, oh, go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. No problem. I was just going to say, I really agree with Paul on the lack of sophistication around the tools we have right now to really look at the impacts of on whole sort of ecosystems. And there was a great study done for the Bullitt Center, which really looked at the ecosystem services impacts and benefits of that project that went much deeper than many of the tools we have now, and really looked at the full ecology and biodiversity impacts of some of the choices made. But we're really slim on tools that can look at the whole picture, ecologically. I mean, they can look at, carbon, but yeah, what happened in terms of the pollution of the watershed in that area where those materials were made, or the impacts of that transportation, or, what happened to the biodiversity as a result of, the extraction of those materials. That's pretty much largely ignored right now. And we're not really bringing that into the picture of how we're making decisions about what we're sourcing. So, I mean, I think that leads to the sort of question of, we all know we have to drastically reduce carbon, and that's a really big, sort of crisis moment for us. But, ultimately there's other things other than carbon that have been impacted and need to be addressed, such as, the amount of polluted waterways, the, species that have been, extincted or about to be extinguished, the amount of communities that have experienced equitable devastation, and that, how they, lift themselves out of poverty, etc. I mean, there are so many global issues that have arisen as a result of how we consume and focus on creating things for ourselves. That, all of them are unraveling, right? I mean, we've had a global pandemic as for a start, so well, not even a start, but as an example. So I think, this sort of holistic look that regenerative thinking is pushing towards, of looking at the whole system, we really desperately need tools and metrics and abilities to see that whole picture that we don't really have currently.
And that's a perfect segue to our next question around how can we really marry this urgency for net zero carbon with the benefits that regenerative design we know can bring to that whole picture. So the question to the panel is, can we employ regenerative design and nature-based solutions to help buildings reach net zero carbon faster and more cost effectively? I'll maybe start with Bill.
I'd argue yes. So in work that's been going on for several years at a carpet company based in Georgia called Interface, they've been on a path called Factories of Forest, which came from a conversation between their founder, Ray Anderson, and Janine Benyus, where he looked at her one day and said, could my factory ever be as good as the forest that was here? And so it's an exploration of both metrics around the ecosystem services that the forest was providing, but even down to realization that that was a forest that pre-European contact was heavily was on an annual basis frequently burned by the indigenous people, and there was this very different relationship of how people behaved with that ecosystem. One of the big issues for the environmental movement in the United States is it came out of the post-industrial period and also after many of the indigenous people were extirpated, so we didn't have good models of long-term relationships with ecosystems. And I think around the world, people are starting to rediscover those, where there's been long habitation in a positive relationship back and forth between the ecology and the people. And so some of that is really, besides the technological steps and the numeric steps and the ecological steps, re-exploring how to be in place and what it means to be native of a place.
Thank you for that, Bill. And Amanda, I might pull you in because I know we had this conversation around that struggle, the need to scale quickly versus not miss out on looking at the whole big picture, and how do we, again, marry those two. So I want to bring you in on this.
right? We tend to react, and we're definitely in a crisis with carbon and getting to zero carbon, and we need to focus on that. We should react, but I think the hidden pieces around biodiversity or toxicity in communities, ecosystem degradation and etc. that I referred to before, we can't cause more of that as a result, right? So I think it was mentioned before, the unintended consequences are the challenge, and trying to make our buildings super efficient by using a lot of plastic or fossil fuel based products, or using timber from non-sustainable sources, for example, could have those unintended consequences on carbon and actually have a similar carbon impact to what we're reducing. So I think we have to really force ourselves to look at the whole system and to look at the interconnection of all of these issues. And so I do think that also that's probably the only way we can scale. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to get to really zero carbon just by building as we ordinarily do, and just trying to push it on top of it. I think a way to actually scale it is going to be to look at ecological regenerative solutions that can look at what we're developing and building in the first place, can look at how that project or design can really be an ecological response that can have positive impacts, not just on carbon, but wider. And if we do that with the things we create, I think we'll find that we're already probably half, 3/4 of the way there to zero carbon. We won't have to force it on top.
The problem with that, Amanda, if I may.
I just think your scaling at this point is going to require a complete shift. Yeah.
Paul, coming in.
Yeah, no, I love the concept, Amanda, that we're going to have intelligent policymakers setting up policy programs, and we've got clients that embrace and understand this. But I don't see it. And my greatest fear is it's taken us 40 years to get to the state where we've now got, cities declaring climate emergencies, cities signing up or businesses signing up at the rate of knots to have a net zero carbon pledge. But the danger is that it's going to take another 30 years for us to get into that regenerative ecological systems type thinking. So, I don't know, what are you seeing in the markets that you're operating in? But I don't see that interest. I don't see that framework that's pushing, architects and businesses like Google down that road.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the big challenge, in front of us, is that we're not seeing enough of that. I'm seeing some interest, but you're right, it's moved way too slowly over the last 30 years than it should have. What I do see is that the pathways to regenerative thinking, such as zero carbon or biophilic design, are gaining traction. Just this week, what I'm hearing developers say is that, the financiers in this sector and the investors are saying, okay, you need to do, climate risk assessments here about what your developments and your assets are going to look like in the future in terms of climate risk. And so they're being pushed to think about zero carbon. It's not, I don't think, coming from the developer community. I think it's coming from the investment community now first, because they're seeing that as a real risk. So I'm seeing the push on zero carbon really from the fear and risk perspective, which is not the greatest place for it to come from, but it's at least it's pushing it in the direction. And I'm seeing the biophilia piece come in mostly because of health and wellness of people again, and this sort of focus on people's health and wellness versus, is this the right thing to do ecologically for the planet? So I have identified over the last decade or so that zero carbon and biophilia are almost like the pathways towards us getting towards regenerative. And I'm seeing some movement, but you're right. Will we be able to scale it? Will we be able to make that happen in time. I'm working on it, but I'm not sure either we'll be able to get there, to be honest.
So my take on that is that's why we have to use the net zero carbon agenda as almost like a Trojan horse. And we need to build on that sense of emergency and understanding and make certain that we have a holistic approach that actually builds in that resilience into that system, so that we do consider other aspects, and we don't, create that, fixing the carbon problem, solves everything, because we know it doesn't. So, that's why I think it is important to mobilize around net zero carbon, but we have to be really smart and intelligent about how we build in other interventions on the back of that. But we must do that really quickly, in my view. So that's where you bring in absolutely the biophilia, the nature-based solutions. I see that coming through in urban design, and in particular with the COVID pandemic and people's understanding that we need to have spaces, but then those spaces need to be adapted to potential heat waves, downpours, and the future, well, not future impacts, the impacts that we were already encountering around climate change. So I do think if we can take the net zero carbon and make it positive carbon, and then build in positive energy, positive water, net biodiversity gains, then we're kind of like moving in the right direction. And we have to take it as a Trojan horse like approach, in my.
Yeah, Paul, I agree. I mean, I think the projects I've seen that have pursued net zero carbon, have pursued net zero water, they wind up looking at nature-based solutions because they're looking at every solution. Like when you're trying to get to net zero, when you're trying to get to net positive, as you've described, you kind of can't leave any stone unturned. And so I do think that the more you layer on, if you're doing carbon and water, you just start to see those synergies come through even more powerfully. I'm happy. I don't know if you want to add to that before I share a little bit of a project case study, but I'd also be interested in your thoughts on a project that we've been working on through some of this. All right, I'm going to go ahead. I can't tell if we're just on delay. So yeah, we've been working through some of the regenerative design solutions on a development project in the San Francisco Bay Area called the Bayview Project, and it's over. Let's see if I can do the conversion, 100,000 square meter development project, 3 buildings, and a significant amount of landscaping. And when we showed up, it was essentially a gravel patch. We were in the middle of a drought, and we said, we're going to restore water systems to this site. We're going to build ecology into the landscape and produce more water than the site uses to operate. And so we're pursuing the Living Building Challenge water pedal there. And I think that the approach to water is really similar to the approach to carbon, right? The first thing that you look at is demand and efficiency and how little water energy can you use. And one of the big systems that we wound up installing is the largest geothermal system in North America for heating and cooling, which not only saves a huge amount of energy and allows us to 100% electric heat and cool our building, but saved about 8 million gallons of water per year. And so once you have that demand locked in, we started looking at how do we use the right water for the right demand. And that basically meant bringing recycled water into the building and using it for toilet flushing and processed water. But similarly with energy, I think that would be asking a question like, how do we go all electric, or how do we use energy not during the peaks, but during the valleys in terms of demand for energy? And then we really got into nature-based solutions and addressing the stormwater retention on site and connecting it into our wastewater system. So that's where we looked at the historical wet meadows and ponds and how deep they would be and how large they would be at different times of the year, and basically sized our retention ponds to kind of run them through and create the natural habitat that is kind of historically available on that site. And not only did we then incorporate that stormwater in our recycled water system, which generates about 18 million gallons of water a year, but you're creating ecology, you're creating habitat, and you're sequestering carbon in not only the trees that we're planting, but the soil. And then after all of that, we're looking at the project and we still are not producing more energy or more water than we're using. And so to actually accomplish the target, we had to scale jump the project and basically built a larger wastewater treatment plant than our site needed. so that we could take wastewater from our neighbors, treat it on site, and return it to them as recycled water that they could use instead of potable water for landscaping and toilet flushing. And I think that's a really interesting thing for us to think about with carbon. Like, what does that scale jumping approach look like that's not saying we're going to go, cap methane on the other side of the planet and offset that way? But if we look at the community scale for carbon, similar to how you have to look at it for water, how do we think about offsetting or handprinting a project's carbon footprint within its community to put that positive carbon sequestration potential back into the landscape?
We had a project with National Geographic Society that wanted to take their complex in downtown Washington, D.C. to net zero, and we realized we could get them most of the way there. They were getting all the electricity from dedicated wind that they actually invested in, but we couldn't get them all the way there. And so the question was, how do we feel about offsets? And quite frankly, do we trust that those offsets halfway around the globe are being actually going to be effective when we've got people here in Washington, D.C. who can't pay their own energy bills? And so with National Geographic and a foundation that funds low-income housing in the United States, Enterprise Community Partners, created a mechanism called engaged offsets, where you actually have offsets that are voluntary, but are used to invest in renewable energy and advanced energy efficiency in low-income housing in the community where you are. And the nice thing about verification is you can walk a block away and look at that roof and see the system on that roof and know where your money went and who's getting benefited. And the whole community solar movement within the United States is really growing rapidly. Just in New York City, one organization is close to having installed just over the last 6 years, 20 megawatts on rooftops in New York City of PV community financed. So we're seeing these mechanisms evolve of how do we address these issues with creative finance, but also engaging people.
So that's good at looking at operational energy, but that does leave an elephant in the room around embodied carbon. And that's, when we think about the challenges in the next 10 years or so, I think that's where it's going to be, because we've got a lot of heavy energy intensive materials that are man-made. They're not bio-based, so they're going back to that, regenerative aspect around using ecosystem services and nature providers for those materials. And we have a model that is still heavily dependent around those man-made materials, which are creating pollution and biodiversity loss. And so that's certainly one area of focus that we really need to concentrate on in the next 10 years. And if you look at the transition pathways for some of those heavy intensive materials, such as steel and cement, you're going into 2040 or 2045. So we need to see innovation, R&D, material substitution, or indeed improvements in the specification and embodied carbon in some of these basic building products.
So I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, and I think
Go ahead, Amanda.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that, I think that, while there's been some really interesting and fascinating kind of research development and products, hitting the market that are bio-based, growing materials, thinking about how, we can really rethink the materials, marketplace. Yeah, the challenge is how do we scale that? And, how do we, bring them to the market in ways that can replace cement and steel that are so entrenched and, considered low risk, for example, compared with newer materials, and how do we bring those innovations into the market? I'd love to hear if any of you have thoughts on how to scale some of these bio-based materials, because I really do think that's the way we need to head.
And this is where I wanted to kind of take the conversation from a bit of the challenge focus to the opportunities focus. And at this point, you know, we have decades of experience and leadership in sustainable building and design here with us on the panel. So I'd love to go around and hear from each of you one really exciting nature-based or regenerative design solution that you are seeing has a lot of promise to be able to scale their uptake in building and construction. Maybe I'll start with Andreas.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to hear Amanda's response to this one, because I feel like you've kind of flirted with the idea of mass timber when paired with responsible sourced timber and sustainable forestry. And so I think that's where I see a huge amount of potential to look at a bio-based solution for the structure of a building rather than traditional concrete and steel. I think, well, I'll start by saying, for anyone not familiar with mass timber, I think the idea is basically wood structure buildings rather than concrete and steel structure buildings. It's largely done with cross-laminated timber and glue laminated beams, although there's less adhesive heavy options on the market as well. And the hope there, I think, is that the project can deliver on budget or below budget, on schedule or faster, a more beautiful and biophilic building that has a significantly reduced embodied carbon footprint. And the carbon opportunity, I think it comes from three places. The first one is that there's less carbon actually required to produce the structural members for mass timber than there would be for concrete and steel, which require a huge amount of heat and energy. And that's traditionally, I'm sure there's certain materials that are concrete and steel that may come closer to certain wood products. But I think when you optimize the systems, that's where you see the potential with the wood product. Additionally, you know, because it's wood structure rather than concrete and steel, you're seeing that the buildings are lighter and therefore require smaller foundations. So smaller foundation, less material, less carbon that you need to commit there as well. And then the third is probably the most interesting and also the most controversial, but that's that wood is essentially physically sequestered carbon. And so if you're able to extract timber from a forest and continue to allow the forest to thrive and sequester carbon, you have an opportunity there to either, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to burn the wood and turn it into energy? But that's going to put CO2 back in the atmosphere. If you store the wood in your building for 50 or 100 or 200 years, and you have a good plan for what happens to the product next, I think it's an interesting opportunity that starts to present itself there, where you're not building with concrete and steel, you're storing this wood for a long time, and ideally, we're applying it in such a way that is actually promoting sustainable forestry, right? If we snapped our fingers and tomorrow every building was going to be mass timber instead of traditional construction, we might have a problem on our hands, right? But if we, as we start to build out the mass timber infrastructure and folks asking for mass timber products and buildings, part of the demand is that it comes with certifications, with best practices of sustainable forestry. It starts to present an interesting opportunity to not only bring business to some of the folks that are already doing some of the best practices, but bring additional forests along to better management in the long term. So anyway, I think there's a lot of further conversations to have around mass timber, but to me, it's an exciting conversation to be kicking off right now.
Europe did some interesting work on that topic, and we saw, because we're working on a huge public infrastructure project in the Northwest, that will all be timber. If the wood is not sustainably sourced and it's not local, you're still better than concrete and steel, but you still have a carbon footprint. If it is locally sourced and it's done with long-term forest management and sustainability and plan, you can actually wind up with a material that sequesters carbon for the entire life of the project. So you wind up with a building material that has a positive carbon footprint rather than a negative one. The other interesting thing for us is interest in biophilic design has really, in the public mind, has really jumped in the pandemic. People craving a connection to nature. And one of the sort of ancillary effects of that is seeing additional interest and growth in a group called the Biophilic Cities Network, which is a network of now nearly 30 cities around the world who are using different ways to help connect citizens to nature through biodiversity counts, through connected parkways, through all sorts of really interesting programs. And then the cities are publicly sharing what they're doing with each other through the Biophilic Cities Network. And the network is hosted by the University of Virginia's School of Architecture, and has really good case studies now on what cities around the world are doing. Singapore and Viterra-Gessie's in the Basque Country, and Manchester and San Francisco, just amazing Wellington, variety of cities and what they're doing. Each city is doing something different, and it's really amazing to see what's happening in those places.
So, if I may, I mean, I was excited by your answer, Andreas, because in my former life, when I worked for WWF, I helped start up and establish, along with colleagues, the Forest Stewardship Council, which is probably quite familiar to you in terms of FSC timber. However, you know, that mass timber approach doesn't work everywhere. If we go over to where Amanda currently is in Australia, there is hardly a forestry industry that would be able to support and promote and provide the types of products you're describing. So it's horses for courses, but I do believe in that approach around bio-based materials. And a couple of things that we've been exploring, and I think are taking off, and actually going back into, you know, Bill, your territory in North America, looking at engineered bamboo timber. So bamboo has really fast sequestration of carbon, 10 times faster than trees. Space-wise, you know, in terms of comparing it with forestry or woodlands, you need 12 times less space. Equally important, and it's a debate that's happening in the UK at the moment, particularly with the Grenfell inquiry, which was a major fire that happened in one of our tall tower blocks. It is fire resistant bamboo, at least Class A is a fire rating, and it does have a strength weight ratio better than steel. So talking about the points that you raised previously, Andres. So that's one area. And actually at Grimshaw, we've got a PhD architect actually who's looking at bamboo technology and providing some solutions. There's also on a similar vein, mass plywood paneling. That's something else which we think is kind of taking off. And we see that happening in North America as well. And then finally, I think going back to nature-based solutions and understanding other products that we can be using. You know, we've got a brilliant architect that's doing a PhD in coral architecture. So if you go beneath the sea and you start to understand how corals formed, that sequesters carbon. And actually the biodiversity it supports actually is really high density, and coral's got great strength. So I think there's a lot more learning that we can gain from looking at coral architecture. So there's a couple of observations from me.
Thank you, Paul. And Amanda, do you have any favorites?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a fan of bamboo, actually. Probably, you know, I have concerns about mass timber. I think it's completely the right solution for certain parts of the world where we know that, yes, we are, you know, growing the forests in a sustainable way, it's regional, and it's the right approach probably for parts of the world like Pacific Northwest, where I've just moved from, but I'm not sure it's the right approach for other parts of the world. And I think the challenge would be is if we start to push it out as a solution for everywhere. So yes, I think different solutions for different regions is pretty key in the next decade. I'm also a fan of bamboo strategies. I also am a huge fan of looking at kit parts and thinking about how we might unitize buildings to get, you know, much more materials efficiency, speed of construction, and ability to, you know, really simplify the construction process. I think that's one thing that's interesting that's coming out of the mass timber sort of push, is that it's actually looking at how we construct buildings a little differently, and how we actually can sort of look at units and efficient sizes that can really reduce the amount of materials. So I actually also think that's a really great solution versus the sort of bespoke every time building. You know, how do we actually get economies of scales? You know, prefab has been sort of around the edges for a while, but not quite scaled to, you know, the space that we need it. But I've seen some really interesting, a couple of companies that are pushing that to the next level that is emerging. But I also really love the, you know, some of the work that's come out of some of the MIT labs about growing buildings with fungus, growing fabrics, growing materials, you know, looking at how we can grow algae into materials. I think, you know, it's those bio-based materials are just starting the surface really of research and development, and haven't really been brought into the market in a serious way, that in a way that I think they could be.
Just on bamboo, I mean, my word of caution around some of this is, when you think about what we've done in the food industry with palm oil or soya, or we look at actually bamboo, which was you know, supported as an investment for forestry in places like Portugal, etc. And we look at what the nutrients are, and soil conservation, soil biodiversity is absolutely really critical, actually, in terms of regenerating our planet. The shallow roots in bamboo, etc. You know, we do have to be really careful where and how we apply some of these solutions. You know, just remembering that those unintended consequences that we were talking about before.
Thank you for that. I wanted to bring in a question from the audience, because it touches on a really interesting point around how, you know, buildings are also not static. They change over time, their use changes. And the question posed is, does the panel have any thoughts on how a net positive site can be designed to also be more adaptive for future use cases? Would you consider that to be an expected outcome, or would it be something that you would have to be fully specified from the outset?
So if I may jump in here, I was just thinking, and I was just struck by what Amanda was saying recently about a kit of parts. I think, you know, part of this whole design and construction process, when we're thinking about regenerative design, must include that adaptation and reuse. So we need to be thinking automatically about how we design for deconstruction or how we design for repurposing. And it's interesting, you know, when I look back at the Grimshaw portfolio, we did a project for Herman Miller, which is a furniture factory outside of Bath in England. And you know, 20, 30 years later, it changed hands, and it came to a university, and they approached us as the original architects, saying, how can we repurpose that building into a university teaching facility and workshop? But because we've designed it as a kit of parts, the actual adaptation and repurposing was fairly straightforward. I mean, there was hardly any change to the facade, but again, it's about smart thinking. And one of the things that's starting to happen, and we can see this in policy making, is the application of the principles of the circular economy. And you know, one of those principles is, you know, repurposing or design for life extension. Another one is designing for reuse or indeed upcycling. And in particularly in London, where I live, you know, there's policy mechanisms now in place for large major developments to actually have to answer that question as part of that planning process. So I think, you know, that kit of parts, that understanding how we can repurpose and make better use and improve the functionality of our buildings is starting to come online. And that's incredibly important, particularly now when we've got this challenge around the COVID pandemic of how we regenerate and repurpose our city centres, if these city centres are going to need to change and adapt because of changes in workflow and workplace environments. So I do see it coming. I think there's a lot more thought and inquiry that's required behind this. But it's definitely something that we should be future-proofing for. So building on that net positive experience that person asked in that question, future-proofing it, so that we can continue that.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is something that we've talked about quite a bit at Google, especially as we started building our own buildings for the first time. So we pretty much considered ourselves hermit crabs for a long time, where we would find someone else's shell and move in. And we're just starting to actually build our own buildings. And so thinking about where we make the long-term investment in structure versus what we want to leave much more flexible and adaptable has been extremely important, both in terms of the carbon investment of the materials that we're putting into the space and how we want to design for deconstruction and reconstruction or reuse. And I think a big part of it is that what Paul was talking about, acknowledging that work is changing and that we needed to acknowledge that as a company, that we started as a search organization with a certain type of engineers. And now there's, self-driving cars and different types of software and different types of hardware, huge sales organizations. I work in real estate. Like, I never thought I was going to work for a technology company. And so making sure that we're not only able to create a workspace that works from day one, but understanding that that work environment could change massively in the next decade and in the 100, 200 years that building's going to be physically present. So how do you plan the structure to allow for that shift? And then how do you plan some of the sets and things that are going to last for 10 to 20 years within that space to be deconstructed and reconstructed? And what do you fill the space with, essentially?
Bill, I think you wanted to come in on this one.
Yeah, I mean, we're all designers, and most of the folks in the GBCs are designers and contractors and manufacturers, and we focus on the new. So one of the projects that our company did was the analysis of the building stock of New York City. There are more than 1 million buildings in New York City, and this was a carbon analysis for the city. And everyone wants to focus on the really big skyscrapers, and they're important and they're a big footprint, but the vast majority of the building stock of New York City is 1 to 4 story buildings built in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And no one was focusing on that. And yet, if you really want to reduce the carbon footprint of New York City, that's where the work needs to be. And that's not just the case in New York City, it's in a lot of places. It's the smaller existing buildings that we're kind of overlooking. And so we need to come up with both creative, technical, but also financial and social solutions to help address that building stock.
Thank you, Bill. And sorry, we've got one more here, trying to squeeze quite a few from the audience. What are your thoughts on the use of recycled materials for modern methods of construction from an embodied carbon perspective?
Well, I think.
Well, I think there's a.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Go ahead, Andrew. Well, I think there's a place for, I think we're moving now more from, purely recycled to circular, and really, focusing on how the product, when it's created in the first place, has this circle to be able to be completely reused. I think, yeah, we need to, recycling is obviously great to use recycled and repurposed materials, but I think we need to think more holistically at the system of how we actually get the circular economy moving, because so many materials actually don't end up being recycled as such a small component of them, or the energy use that goes into actually kind of, recycling them can sometimes, not help us from a carbon perspective. So I think, that again, the whole system of circularity is, gaining more and more traction, which I think is fantastic. But really thinking about how we're manufacturing for the full circle, I think is where we really are heading.
Yeah. Big agreement on the planning for circularity and building new products that will allow for reuse in the future. I also just wanted to call out, Paul had earlier mentioned the need for sustainable concrete and sort of cement replacements. And so I think that's a huge opportunity with recycled materials, where we've traditionally seen as a cementitious replacement, at least in the US. I'm still kind of learning what's being used in Europe. But we see a lot of coal fly ash and slag used as cementitious replacements in our concrete mixes. And it's a huge opportunity, right? Like if you basically say that's coal waste, it's already been used, you know, we burn the coal for energy, now it's just sitting there, it's going to go to the landfill. We can actually use that in our concrete mixes as a cementitious replacement that saves a huge amount of energy that would be used on that cement. I mean, it's one of the best ways to reduce the carbon footprint of concrete today. But that said, it's a byproduct of the coal power process, and we're going to see that coal fly ash becomes less and less ubiquitously available in the United States. And what happens next, right? What do we replace that with? And so I just think there's a huge opportunity to make sure we don't go back to much higher cement concentrations, and that we explore things like glass pozzolan. Glass is only about 30% recycled in the United States. And most of the stuff that's not recycled is the small bits that are really hard to kind of sort out and get the greens with the greens and the whites with the whites. And like, to be able to just pulverize that stuff and use it as a cementitious replacement feels like it's a huge opportunity. And I know there's a lot of other sort of recycled content cementitious replacements out there. And I think that just that form of sustainable concrete, I think, is really important for the industry.
So, yeah, no, I think, you know, the recycled content of construction materials does have a part to play in reducing the embodied carbon of infrastructure and on buildings. You know, clearly, as Amanda says, we need to understand that there is that feedback loop where if the building is going to be reconstructed, those parts and those materials remain active in a system somewhere and not redundant. So that's important. And I was just wanting to bring the audience, make them aware of a research project that Grimshaw are participating on, which is looking at circular construction in regenerative cities. And so London is one of those cities. We're a partner with London, but Helsinki, Copenhagen, there's about 29 cities. And part of this research project is actually trying to understand the materials passport that is found in buildings and how we can best utilize those materials and keep them active in an economic system rather than redundant. So looking for demonstration projects, understanding the building transformation that needs to happen and how we get flexibility in design is part of that research program. So it's a 3-year program. So Google Circuit, and hopefully you'll find that of interest.
Thank you, Paul. And Bill, did you want to jump in before we move to our next question?
So we're also, the pozzolan work is something we've been involved in, and it's interesting because it changes the chemistry to make concretes actually more similar to the original Roman concretes and improve the performance. But we've also been watching companies who are now working towards biomineralization of the limestone within the concrete out of CO2. And that's just starting to be commercialized, and we're pretty intrigued by that. It's in effect making concrete the same way that corals form in the ocean, and so some of those bio-based techniques are intriguing.
Thank you, Bill. I was going
to say there's plenty of volcanic ash still to use, which is what the Romans used. And there are technology companies that are trying to deploy the use of natural pozzolana as a Portland cement replacement. And it's been used in the States, particularly in Texas.
Thank you, Paul. I wanted to start to slowly head us towards a bit of a wrap up. I think from the conversation so far today, we've heard a lot about in terms of some of the challenges and barriers that still exist. I think what I heard was that there's quite a lack of tools that are going to help people in their decision-making process early on. But I wanted to get a bit more of your perspective in terms of some of the key barriers that each of you see in terms of seeing this real rapid shift towards regenerative design. Is it because it is complicated, it requires very holistic approach? Are there other barriers that you see that we really should be focusing on taking down if we want to see that rapid shift?
Where to
Yeah,
start?
I mean, I think, yeah, right. I was just taking a
You're gonna
breath
go first,
there too,
Amanda?
thinking the same thing. Should I step into this first? Yeah, I mean, there are so many barriers to remove. But where do I see the shifts happening? I think, well, I think people are seeing systems declining rapidly in front of their eyes, and you know, the global pandemic, with bushfires, with things changing. I do think it's urging people to finally move in a direction that I think a certain group of of people in the world have known we've had to for move in that direction for 30 years, but or more. So I do see movement. I think it's currently a cause of things impacting people's daily lives. I mean, I think we've seen with coronavirus how suddenly things can change overnight if we have the will to do it. So in some ways that gives me hope that we actually can mobilize when we really need to, and we can shift how we do things if we really need to. But I think also, my sense of the people I'm talking to that are really exploring regenerative design, and it surprised me how much it's popped up in sort of government and large scale development and in projects, sort of all big and small at different scales and different locations recently, is that people are seeing the connection points between things in a way that I think perhaps they didn't see. How do we shift it? I mean, I think we have to shift everything. We have to have some policy change. We have to change the way that we train architects. We have to, revalue our whole economic systems. There's a lot of people working on regenerative economics, regenerative agriculture to try and make those shifts. The models are there. But ultimately, I think, as we've discussed before, I think, my focus has been on sort of the gateways of zero carbon biophilic design to shift us in that direction, because regenerative design does require a radical rethink for how we actually even create buildings in the first place and how we value them, and how we invest in them and what they are and exist as investment opportunities, etc. So it's going to take a radical shift for us to move entirely in the regenerative direction, but I see us moving gradually, and I see us, I think, hopefully being able to adopt more regenerative thinking and systems thinking as we embrace even more zero carbon and biophilia at the same time.
Thank you, Amanda. Paul, did you want to come in next?
Yes, thank you. I still think there is a lack of awareness between the interplay between some of these terms that we talked about. And I think that lack of awareness clearly happens in the political level, it happens within the design and construction sector. And clearly it's probably not on the radar of really consumers. They probably would expect it to be taken care of beforehand. And so that lack of awareness is really about the importance of restoring, then establishing a regenerative built environment. And I think that the shift and the key opportunity is the word resilience, because a lot of cities are mobilizing around being more resilient, and we need to work out how regenerative design helps cities become more resilient. And I think the other in here, not just net zero carbon, is the health and wealth agenda. When we look at the mass changes, the political shift that has occurred, particularly in the environment movement, it's always typically because there's been a public health issue. So if it's lead in petrol, if it's the ozone, depletion and pollution and carcinogenics and skin cancer, etc. So I think I think there is the entry point around health and well-being and the understanding of how without regenerative design building resilience, you then lead to further disruption. That creates social discourse, which is a huge big issue for politicians right now, a lack of social cohesion. And we haven't really talked much about the social implications and how they add and can be supported to the regenerative design aspect. But I think that's important. And Amanda's clearly mentioned it, you know, poor policy, economic models that are really blunt. We don't value and measure the things that really matter. We don't have the tools to demonstrate those benefits and opportunities. And actually our governance systems slow us down. So if you think about construction materials and the loop and the process that you would have to get your product fit for market in terms of the assurances needed, it takes years. So in a sense, you know, that can stifle innovation itself. It can stop entrepreneurs bringing ideas and products to market. You know, aspects around warranties and risks. Not every client is possibly as enlightened as Andreas, who wants to push the boundaries and use it as an experiment and an opportunity. And that's, you know, but the hope is, and this is one thing I think we should stay positive, COVID sadly has taught us that we can actually react. We can come together. You know, government, industry with businesses and civil society can start to you know, respond, you know, in an emergency-like situation. We've just got to, you know, up the ante and make sure people realise that this is an emergency and it's not going to go away.
Yeah, realizing what's at stake. Bill, and then maybe Andreas.
I'm, well, obviously the entry point in the conversation around biophilia for us has been a major piece. So something that we focused on quite a while. And we, in a shameless plug, we just completed a book with the Royal Institute of British Architects called Nature Inside, Guide for Biophilic Design. And it was released a couple weeks ago. I have a draft copy here. But there's another movement that really intrigues me, and I'm interested in watching how they're sort of slowly gaining traction, and it's called the drawdown movement. And it's a movement of saying, okay, getting to zero is important, but we need to go further than that. We actually need to be actively sequestering carbon. And how do we do that? And some of the techniques are really surprisingly simple. And so drawdown.org has an extensive website with good science, really good science behind it on things that individuals can do and companies can do and cities can do and, you know, and national governments can do to encourage the sequestration of carbon. And so it's 100 different measures that move us towards beyond net zero and into actually pulling carbon and putting it back into ecosystems and back into the soil and back to where it should be.
Thank you, Bill. Andreas?
Yeah, I think you know, one of the barriers that we see with regenerative design and with regenerative building products is, you know, kind of to Paul's point, just the risk that gets built into then either padding cost or schedule for a project. And frankly, I think it's part of it is just we need more people asking for certain types of products and to help try to move markets that way. But I think it's also worth taking the time to drill into what those costs are. You know, again, what Paul was talking about around some products, is it R&D costs? Is it just getting off the ground? But then there's the potential in 3 or 5 or 10 years to actually have a cheaper product that's scalable and going to change the way that the market is. Or is it just part of the process that it's always going to be more expensive? I think one of the things we do is we try to understand from our project teams, if we're getting those ad costs, what is the baseline product you're talking about? Because sometimes that doesn't meet our requirement, that doesn't meet our contract, and we can change the baseline to bring down the additional costs that we're seeing. And also, you know, understanding, is it the product cost and where that could potentially go long term? Is it additional labor? Or is it really just some form of risk that's being built into what the quote is? And so I think it's a little bit around understanding where that is kind of the, that there's a financial association with risk. And then I think for us at Google, it's understanding that what we're investing in has the ability to scale long term. The goal is not to come up with solutions that work for one Google office or even all Google offices, but to come up with something that works for all new buildings, all remodel projects, all buildings in operation, and has the ability to scale to really anybody who's working in the building industry or potentially other industries. And so just making sure that we're spending our time and effort on the right things, and that we're asking those questions of our project teams, and hopefully they're taking those that curiosity or those products and processes that work well to other projects that they're working on for other clients.
It does really feel like the discourse around this need to move towards more regenerative design is growing, and that's exciting because we have such a wealth of expertise. All of you have been doing this and pushing for this for a long time, and so hopefully we're going to be seeing that demand meeting the availability of your design expertise and knowledge. As we wrap up, I just wanted to leave the audience with any last key takeaways from each of you that that you wanted to share before we wrap up. Phil, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, well, thank you for engaging in the conversation. And if there ever was something to drive creativity in design and construction, this is the issue. It connects so many different pieces together, and hopefully creates better places for people.
Yeah, I would say I think what we badly need is individuals who make the shift. The really interesting thing about the focus on biophilia over the last decade or so, when I've talked to people about it, is this sort of awakening that happens in people. It's like this connection to nature, and I think is innate, and I think also intrinsically we want to design with ecology. I think we've sort of lost our way, is how I often refer to it, and that we've kind of lost that connection. I think we've often lost the confidence that we can actually kind of have a voice to bring ecology and nature to the surface of these conversations. So I think the key thing is that, I think several people who've worked on regenerative practice for a while say it starts with each individual kind of really transforming the way they work and think about their work and think about the way we create buildings. So, I think all the people on this call, I challenge you, I guess, to rethink, to push, to, challenge the people you work with and how we buildings, how we go about buildings, and to, challenge the status quo.
Yeah, I think as part of that call to action, it's easy in 2020, I think, to think if to 2030 is the decade of action, maybe we have a lot of time, but we're 8% of our way through the decade of action. And so we're kind of long past getting started, right? And so I think we need to prioritize, we need to communicate and share with each other, and we need to commit and to start taking action. And I think I get excited when I see some of the announcements come out internationally or from companies about how they're going to measure themselves by 2030. And those are massive levers that I'm hoping we can start to pull on to drive initiatives across, a variety of projects, across a variety of professions. If you don't have a lever that you feel like is driving your work, maybe that's a good place to start, is with the leadership of an organization, or see what's out there in your country or in your requirements that you're going to be held accountable for by 2030, and start making that movement forward.
Thank you. And Paul?
So I think, looking back at Grimshaw's history, I mean, the partners and the architects involved in, flagship projects like Eden down in Cornwall in England, where regeneration and ecosystem services were right at the heart of those design interventions. And even today, with projects around the world, we are always looking at biomimicry, understanding the orientation and the sensitivity, going back to Bill's point about understanding how nature existed in that place prior to that development. But I have to say, we need to collaborate. We need to share experiences. We need to put out the questions out there to academics, to industrialists, to others, to come and help provide the solutions, because we're nowhere near, being where we need to be. I'm not talking about the practice. I'm talking about that built environment professionals. And we need those clients. We need Andreas's Google and others to be, pushing this. But we need to do it so quickly. And that's really that what worries me. But I do think if we can start to collaborate, share ideas, and move, I guess in a critical path to really address this, then there's every chance, and we must do it. And so it's been a wonderful conversation today. Every conversation, you always learn something, don't you? And I think this has been fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Yes, it makes me so hopeful that within a net zero carbon conversation, we could bring this dialogue in, and you really see this acceleration moving from speaking about operational to embodied to circularity. I think it is picking up so quickly. So thank you for taking the time and being with us here today and sharing your great expertise and your tools and resources that you have with the audience today. So thank you for that. I will just wrap up with a last, don't forget that you can join our call to action by endorsing our statement and support the campaign to accelerate net zero buildings through policies. So thank you again. Remember, we must act on climate for our sector, and to be able to get our net zero buildings there, they are the answer. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day or evening, Amanda. Thank you for keeping with us so late. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.